Happy New Year and welcome back to Southeast Asia Radio. This week, we'll cover the latest developments in the Duterte-Marcos feud, President Prabowo Subianto's free meal program, and a mass amnesty program timed for Myanmar's 77th independence anniversary.
We'll also cover Thai Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawat's asset declaration. I'm Japhet Kitson. Today is January 9th, 2025. This week, Greg and Elina look ahead at what's coming to Southeast Asia in 2025. Before that, let's start with our headlines.
Welcome back, Japhet. Great to see you.
Great to see you too. How is the region?
Nice and warm. The food in Vietnam and Singapore was amazing, of course, and it was great catching up with family for the holidays. How about you? How was California?
Also nice and warm, but it's such a big shift coming back to DC. I miss all of my usual food places, and I miss the weather.
Honestly, yeah, the snow here is horrible right now.
It's not good.
But to introduce our first story, I must ask, did you get anything fancy for Christmas?
Nothing particularly fancy, though I may buy myself a new work bag soon as a treat.
Perhaps a work-in?
Not the work-in. For our listeners who don't know, Walmart's released a viral bag that's a $78 dupe to the famous Hermes Birkin.
It's literally all I'm seeing on Instagram right now. I'm wondering how Hermes hasn't gotten the listing taken down yet?
Only time will tell how long the bag will be available online. But do you know who probably has the real deal? Thailand's Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawat.
That's right, because Paetongtarn declared over $400 million in assets last week, which included more than 200 designer handbags worth over $2 million and at least 75 luxury watches valued at almost $5 million.
At such a high number, she has been declared Thailand's richest prime minister. It's noteworthy that Paetongtarn's reported fortune has surpassed that of her father, former Prime Minister Thaksin, who's a billionaire tycoon in the telecommunications business.
You know what? Good for her. At least she was honest with her disclosures.
Yeah, I guess so. Good for her indeed. But let's move on to someone who hasn't been so honest with her disclosures. In the latest installment of the Duterte-Marcos feud, President Marcos removed Vice President Sara Duterte from the National Security Council. Her father, Rodrigo Duterte, among other former presidents, was also removed from the NSC.
The executive order was aimed to reorganize and streamline NSC membership, as well as to uphold national security amid a challenging and constantly evolving backdrop in the Philippines and its surrounds.
Interestingly, Sara Duterte says she was never part of these meetings in the first place. According to her, she didn't receive any invitation to attend NSC meetings since she assumed office in 2022.
Interesting. If y'all remember, Sara Duterte is in hot water after an expletive-laden livestream threat against the president, his wife, and Speaker of the House, Martin Romualdez, last November.
Right, and when she was asked to appear before the National Bureau of Investigation in December, she didn't show up. There are bigger issues, too. On top of the fallout between the once unstoppable unit team, the Philippines' 2025 national budget may be in legal jeopardy.
Heard about that one, too. President Marcos signed the budget bill into law on December 30th after a week of delays stemming from an accusation that the Philippine legislature was diverting money from health and education towards personal pet projects. Marcos wound up vetoing $3.3 billion worth of budget items that he deemed inconsistent with the administration's priority programs. But it turns out that this wasn't enough to deny the pet project allegations.
The entire subsidy for the Philippine Health Insurance Corporation, or PhilHealth, was slashed, for instance. Without this, the budget fails to meet the constitutional requirement for health and education prioritization.
Pro-health organizations are already vowing to file a case against the Marcos government for defunding PhilHealth.
Critics also pointed out the government taking out $172 million from the Education Department's Computer and Internet Access Program and putting it toward local infrastructure projects in ACAP, an unconditional cash transfer project aimed toward low-income Filipinos.
Sounds like pork barrel.
That's what they said. Politicians could definitely take advantage of these programs to whip up support in their home districts.
So in summary, it's a bit of a mess. We'll have to pay close attention to the domestic situation in the Philippines leading up to this year's midterm elections.
Yes, we will. On to our next story, which follows President Prabowo's $4.3 billion free meal scheme, which launched on January 6th to combat malnutrition across the nation.
Wow, that sounds both ambitious and expensive. How was Prabowo able to fund it?
Well, after being sworn into office last October, Prabowo traveled to several countries seeking financial support and was able to sign a $10 billion deal with Chinese President Xi Jinping in November for support in several areas, including the free meal program.
But while able to fund the program now, critics deem the initiative financially unsustainable and that it may threaten to jeopardize the country's fiscal prudence.
However, Prabowo continues to defend his program, describing it as strategic in countering child malnutrition and spurring growth in Indonesia's economy at a regional level.
The initiative plans to feed 15 million people, budgeting just 10,000 rupiah or 69 US cents per meal. Under the scheme, Prabowo aims to reduce the current 21.5% stunting rate amongst children to just 5% by 2045.
We're wishing this program success and look forward to seeing how it develops.
Moving on to our final story of the day. On January 4th, Myanmar celebrated 77 years of independence from the United Kingdom. The military government marked the occasion with a flag-raising ceremony at Naypyidao's City Hall.
Around the same time, more than 6,000 prisoners celebrated their release from prison.
That makes sense. Holidays and other big occasions are often marked by mass prisoner releases.
The release of the over 6,000 prisoners plus the commuting of the sentences of many more are just a drop in the bucket, unfortunately. There remain over 21,000 prisoners detained by the government of the 28,000 arrested on political charges since the 2021 coup.
The situation on the ground in Myanmar remains challenging, with intensifying conflicts between the junta and armed opposition groups throughout the country continuing to spread far and wide.
Refugees, desperate to get away from the violence, have poured over Myanmar's borders into neighboring countries where they've encountered challenge after challenge.
Exactly. On January 4th, Malaysian authorities turned away 2 boats of Rohingya refugees carrying nearly 300 people. Though the boats were resupplied with food and drinking water, they were escorted out of the country with no clear destination.
Malaysia, a Muslim country, is an alluring destination for primarily Muslim Rohingya refugees. In November 2024, there were 11,410 Rohingya refugees and asylum seekers registered with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in Malaysia, making up a total of 58% of the country's refugee population.
Given that Malaysia holds ASEAN chairmanship this year, I'm curious to see how they will try to address the situation in Myanmar, especially given Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim's Myanmar-centered remarks over APEC last year. Countless other ASEAN chairs have tried their best since 2021.
And there's only so much they can do with a junta unwilling to negotiate.
Anwar's even listed former Thai Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra as an advisor for his country's chair year.
We'll have to see if Thaksin's advising leads to any breakthroughs for ASEAN this year.
I wouldn't hold my breath on that one. But with that, those were our headlines for today. Did we miss anything that you wanted to hear about? If so, please write us at scaradio@csis.org or DM us on any of our social media platforms. Up next, Greg and Elina's 2025 forecast. Stay tuned.
Welcome, folks, to the first episode of Southeast Asia Radio of 2025. I am Greg Poling of CSIS, joined again for another year by Elina Noor of the Carnegie Endowment. Hey, Elina.
Hey, Greg. How is it 2025 already?
I don't know, and I didn't mean to imply that you were going to stick around for all of 2025. You might end up with better things to do. But for now, we're still doing this thing. And because we're both coming out of holiday hibernation, and I assume most of the listeners are too, we're recording this on January 3rd. So really just coming out of the hibernation. We thought it would be easiest on us and maybe interesting for the readers to forgo our usual guest and just kind of have the two of us look to the year ahead, what we expect to see in 2025 in the region and I guess Indo-Pacific policy at large, and maybe what we'll be working on. And that was your idea. So I'm going to start with you, Elina. What are we looking at in 2025?
Okay, so my crystal ball is still a little dusty because I've kept it hidden and out of sight for the past year. But as I blow the layers of dust off, I am going to be really boring and say that there will be some continuity in Southeast Asia because government plans and strategies and policies have been set. But I think we're all expecting a little disruption given the change in government in the United States and its interactions with the region in the years to come. So on the continuation trajectory, a lot of excitement still on everything digital in Southeast Asia, including a lot of investment in data centers to power AI systems in the region. With that, I think there will be continued interest in some of the raw materials that will be powering those systems, and that will be going towards the manufacturing of semiconductor chips. The disruption piece, of course, is whether tariffs or not, as we've discussed before, will put a wrench in it, so to speak, in the production line. And so whether Trump's administration is going to mete out tactical tariffs or whether it'll be across the board, I think will have significant implications and impact on Southeast Asia. That's what I see right now in the immediate term. What about you?
I think that's all right. We talked about Trump with Prashant Parmaswaran and Brian Eiler on our post-election podcast. We don't have a lot that we know now that we didn't know then, other than maybe a few more names for the kind of potential Asia portfolios or foreign policy portfolios that give some reason for hope that we'll see more continuity than not. We already knew about Rubio and Walls, Alex Wong for the Asia head at NSC. All of this can still change, of course. But, while we have a few that give people reason to worry, or at least that are unknowns, like Hegseth or Gabbard, I think there's enough folks out there who know where Asia is on a map and have a legislative record on supporting U.S. allies and partners and being tough on China, which is continuity, that I still don't hear any partners really panicking. I'll be curious to see how partners and allies position themselves to kind of butter up the new Trump administration. I mean, we're already seeing that. Obviously, everybody's heading down to Mar-a-Lago or trying to make phone calls or at least trying to get into the orbit, holding their inauguration parties. I'm sure everybody's getting the invitations. Everybody wants to have an inauguration party to show that they did. The one that I think we've talked about in the previous podcast that's, I think, trying the hardest and maybe has the best shot is the Philippines, given that Ambassador Romualdez has been there for so long. He was the representative during the first Trump administration. Trump has no particular animus towards the Philippines. He seems to remember meeting Imelda back in the day. There was a flirtation with the idea of a U.S.-Philippine FTA during the first Trump administration. So maybe we'll see some progress there. Some things will have to be rebranded, like the PGII Luzon Economic Corridor. That PGII name won't work anymore in a Trump administration. And then Vietnam is the one that probably faces the most danger, given the growth in its trade deficit with the U.S. and the increasing amount of Chinese investment in manufacturing in Vietnam. That's going to take some massaging. I think it's possible, but it's going to take a lot of hard work.
I wonder how much of the Trump administration's first few months will be very inward looking, though, given some of the changes that we expect with the Department of Government Efficiency and with some of the attacks that we've seen in the new year in the U.S. So I wonder how much of the White House's policies will be outwardly focused and whether those tariffs will take effect on day one itself.
I don't want us to get too trapped in talking U.S. politics, but this is another one where the signals seem to be at cross purposes, right? Because on the one hand, you do have Doge, and Musk's role and Vivek Ramaswamy's role. All of this talk about moving fast and breaking things when it comes to executive orders. And I think we will see a lot of that, and some of it may well include tariffs on day one. But we also see a degree of dysfunction still that characterized the first Trump administration that they don't seem to have fixed. Trump doesn't seem able to get his preferred leadership in the Senate. It's January 3rd here, so I don't yet know if we're going to have an easy House leadership decision. But even if you do, Mike Johnson's going to be sitting on top of an even thinner House majority than he did last year, and some of his members are going to buck. So my assumption is that the Trump administration will be incapable of passing any legislation. I mean, the one thing everybody assumes they can get done is renewing the 2017 tax cuts. I'm not even sure that they can do that, given the margins they're working with. So it's really just what can the White House do on its own through executive orders, which will then be challenged in the courts. And as you say, most of that, I think, will be inwardly focused, not externally.
Right. Well, as we're recording right now, voting has already begun to decide whether Mike Johnson stays on as speaker or not. But let's not get sidetracked by U.S. politics, as you said. What are you going to be working on for the next few months, at least of this year, Greg, that we should be keeping an eye on?
Well, I think Southeast Asia at CSIS's work will stay focused on two buckets, right? The key bilateral relationships in one bucket and the more regionally focused work on the other. And a lot of the South China Sea work, I guess, kind of falls within that key allies and partners because so much of it is Philippines and Vietnam centric. And so we'll have a ton of attention on the Philippine alliance and how it manages the transition to Trump, as well as on Vietnam, Indonesia as well under the Prabowo government, and maybe a bit of Singapore. And I think those will also match up to the Trump administration's priorities because they were the top priorities in the Biden administration. And they are clearly the partners and allies where either there's already greatest alignment with the U.S. or where there's the most opportunity seen. The other bucket, the regional stuff, a lot of the work that you already highlighted, digital economy and AI, ongoing concern about the energy transition and net zero commitments. And this is a topic that we've done an annual report on for the last several years. Now we'll have to do one on, okay, what is the Trump administration that probably withdraws from Paris, but maybe also increases natural gas exports mean for the energy mix in the region. And we will also be launching another version of the report we've done the last 2 years in a row on public and lead opinion toward the U.S. and China in the region. This one, we will expand by including historic Gallup data going back 15 years or so. And we will expand it to include countries in South Asia and the Pacific Islands in addition to Southeast Asia. But, all of that just encapsulates the stuff I already know we actually have money for, which is not most of the stuff we hope to do this year. So we'll see what else proves to be fungible. How about you?
I mean, it's good that you already have funding secured for that. I don't want to dig myself into a hole that I won't be able to crawl out of. So I'll just list the projects that are imminently on the horizon. I just released a longer report on submarine cables, but drawing together threads on history and climate change and what that means for the digital infrastructure undersea, at least for Southeast Asia. As we're recording this, I expect for another report that I've been burying my head under for the last few months on large language models in Southeast Asia. There have been quite a number of interesting developments on that front, particularly in Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand to a limited extent, but also obviously in Singapore about LLMs that are focused on regional and local languages. And so in the paper, I and a research assistant of mine, Binya Kanitroj, explore what it really means for the region to kind of break away from a lot of the English large language models that are Western oriented, like self-described as Western oriented, and what that means for the knowledge base of Southeast Asia. So I'll be hiving off other papers and projects based on those two large ones, but I also hope to do a lot more connecting submarine cables with data centers as kind of the core digital infrastructure of digitalization in Southeast Asia in the coming months.
Let's talk about developments in the region with or without U.S. involvement that you think are going to be important to watch this year. Because not everything, as much as we might think otherwise, not everything is about Trump and not everything is about the U.S. In many cases, I don't necessarily think that U.S. policy is even going to be the most important determining factor in what happens in the region this year. I'll start. One that I don't think we're giving nearly enough attention to is the ongoing war in Myanmar. Even over the holidays, we saw additional towns fall in Karen State, in Kachin State, Military Operation Command in Rakhine State. We have the Kachin Independence Organization seems to have been able to stare down China a bit and get China to reopen border trade on minerals that they now control. The Thai government held this informal meeting with the other neighbors. So they held with the SAC, the junta in Myanmar, along with representatives from India, Laos, China, and Bangladesh, which accomplished nothing. And China continues to bankroll this plan for a new election this year that the junta plans to hold, which a junta representative in the last couple of weeks announced would happen in fewer than half of the townships across the country. So my expectation is that the junta's position continues to deteriorate on the battlefield and that you may end up with another kind of seismic shift in the balance of power as Operation 1027 was last year that the region will have to respond to. And none of that has anything to do with the U.S., but would be pretty darn important for the region at large.
I expect we'll do an episode on Myanmar very soon, particularly as the junta has promised some kind of elections this year, whether or not one even take place, and two, if it does take place, whether it'll be any sort of credible election is to be seen. But I think that ties up as well with what Malaysia as ASEAN chair will do about the Myanmar question this year. We've seen a very unprecedented move by Anwar Ibrahim to bring on board Thaksin Shinawatra, as well as Retno Marsudi and maybe a few more others in the coming months and weeks as advisors. And I think given Thailand's role in the Myanmar conflict, we may or may not see some creative avenues for a breakthrough. I'm not holding my breath, honestly, but I think you're right. This is a space to watch what happens in Myanmar for the next year or so.
I hope for a productive ASEAN role, but color me skeptical. I think that what we're seeing is actually just a worsening of the divide between Thailand, especially, and to a degree Laos and Vietnam on one hand, who want to get back to a rapprochement with the junta, and Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, maybe Singapore, who I think recognize that the junta lacks legitimacy. It's not actually governing the country. Even if they did want to engage, it doesn't make any sense to recognize something that controls 30% of the country as a legitimate government. I just don't see that getting bridged, Thaksin or no, as an informal advisor, which leads me to believe that ASEAN's role will continue to diminish when it comes to trying to affect the balance within Myanmar.
I'm hopeful that ASEAN's role will not be diminished because without ASEAN, what other options are there? There are a few credible organizations or individual states that have had any sort of bearing on Myanmar. So, well, apart from you, some might argue China, I guess, or even India to a very limited extent. But I mean, I remain an ASEAN optimist in this area.
Point taken. I mean, there are no other options for kind of a negotiated conciliation, but I don't think that there's any negotiated conciliation that can happen anytime soon. This is a revolutionary war against a brutal junta, and the outcome will be decided on the battlefield, not in boardrooms in Jakarta or KL or Bangkok.
Shocking.
All right, what else? That's Myanmar.
I know you have a special affinity for what goes on in the South China Sea, so tell us your predictions.
Bad stuff. I don't know when or exactly at which shoal or how often, but
It's a great outlook.
well, I'm sorry. If we take the last 16 years and counting as any indicator, then yeah, China's going to continue to use violence bordering on lethal violence against its neighbors. They're going to resist. My prognosis remains the same as it's been for several years, which is that China continues to just flail about tactically with these gray zone operations that raise the risk of an accidental escalation, but have not actually gained Beijing anything physically for the last probably 3.5 years. And credit to not just the Philippines, but also Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam for standing firm on oil and gas developments, fishing rights, etc. They haven't really given an inch since 2021, but the risk of accidental escalation is therefore higher than it's been, and it gets higher every year because Chinese Coast Guard and militia spend more and more time ramming people with every passing year, and that's not going to change in 2025.
So here's where I think the US and the Trump administration might actually have an impact. You mentioned that the presence of China hawks in government, whether in the executive or in the legislature, the presence is still there, but Trump's transactionalism may make a change. I'm not sure how to analyze this at all. What's your take? Do you expect things to be worse, or do you expect things to actually be placated somewhat if Trump decides there's a deal to be made?
I cannot imagine a deal to be made brokered by the United States. I mean, unless that deal is to throw Southeast Asian interests overboard and establish a condominium of power in the Indo-Pacific with China. That's a deal that the U.S. could make, but there is no other deal that the U.S. has the power to make. This is not a contest between the U.S. and China. It's a contest between China and its neighbors don't agree among themselves what the outcome should be. I can confidently say there will be no progress on a code of conduct this year. I can confidently say that barring a massive coronary by Xi Jinping, there will be no change in Chinese policy this year on the South China Sea. There will, I think, be a growing desire to manage the escalations that inevitably happen because China is going to face continued domestic challenges and is more focused on Taiwan than on the South China Sea. So I think what we will see is accidental collisions, hopefully not deaths, that China will then work within a certain box to de-escalate, which, for instance, we saw after the June 17th incident last year between China and the Philippines. But that's a really dangerous tightrope to walk, right? Kind of a structural policy that encourages constant low-level aggression, but then a senior-level policy that tries to put a lid on it when it goes too far. And it's always whipsawing between the two in ways that I think are worrying. For silver lining, I actually think there will be continued progress on intra-ASEAN coordination, particularly Philippines, Vietnam, and maybe Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia, on kind of nuts and bolts stuff, search and rescue, fisheries management, etc. I think that the Philippines will continue to garner more and more international support, both for its position in general and for the 2016 Arbitration Award specifically. And we've seen the number of countries publicly endorsing that more than triple in the last 2 years since Marcos came to power. And I think there's a pretty good chance that the Philippines files a second court case or brings a UN General Assembly resolution on the South China Sea, or both. And in either case, it would win.
I wonder how much of domestic politics in the Philippines will distract from what happens with Manila's approaches to the South China Sea. I completely agree with you. This is primarily between the Philippines and China right now, or as we've seen in the past few months. But I think somewhere in the background is the US looming large. Setting the US aside, we just had this episode with Camille talking about the Philippines drama, telenovela between the Marcoses and the Dutertes. And I wonder how much of that is going to distract from what takes place at sea.
If things get really bad, if there's a major, political crisis, sure. But the Philippines, like everywhere else, domestic and foreign policy tend to run on separate tracks. Foreign policy is largely driven by the bureaucracy. There is overwhelming public support for the broad strokes of Marcos's foreign policy, and no sizable support to do the opposite, I guess, which would be pursuing a rapprochement with China. But that was always the case. That was the case under Duterte, and it didn't stop Duterte from winning, and it won't affect, I think, who wins the next time. So the midterms happening this year, I don't see any kind of big constituency in the Philippine Congress that could come into power that would change anything. There's shockingly few who haven't taken a very strong public stance against China in support of Philippine claims. And there's no bureaucratic incentive to dial back the alliance coordination or the proliferation of these other security relationships. So the only way policy changes is if a new president comes into power in Manila that uses kind of their unilateral power to change things, and that can't happen until 2028.
Okay. What else apart from the South China Sea?
Well, Vietnam will spend the entire year positioning for the Vietnamese Communist Party's next General Assembly in 2026. And part of that will be the General Secretary To Lam trying to implement this new restructuring of the bureaucracy, streamlining government bureaucracies to try to cut back on the inefficiencies and the often contradictory lines of authority that have hampered Vietnam's decision-making and economic growth, in combination with the anti-corruption campaign that's got everybody so scared. So this could be a potentially pretty big deal if it goes through. The number one complaint of both Vietnamese policymakers and foreign investors has been the inability to get anything done for 2 years because every official is terrified about falling afoul of the anti-corruption campaign, and foreign investors can't make sense because they often get 3 different answers from 3 different bureaucratic actors. So if they can actually do this, it is a necessary but insufficient step, I think, to restart Vietnam's economic engine.
I agree. I think it would be a pretty major move if things go the way To Lam wants. And all indications seem to be that this is something the investor community is really optimistic about. That said, I wonder how people on the ground in Vietnam feel about this, because very often from the outside, we look at what's going on in government and we look at how the business community feels about government policies or reforms. And we hardly ever take into account the people on the ground and pulse of that sentiment. So it'd be interesting to find out just how ordinary Vietnamese feel about some of these policy changes.
What are your thoughts on what to watch for domestically in Malaysia this year?
I think the usual political shenanigans to be expected, but I think it seems to be all hands on deck for Malaysia's ASEAN chairmanship. I've seen even influencer types on social media trying to rally people around Malaysia's chairmanship. I'm personally quite excited to see what Malaysia comes up with. I hope it'll be something creative. It'd be a wasted opportunity if Malaysia just uses its chairmanship year to steer the organization through to another year. But the government is going out in a big way, making sure that meetings are held in every state in Malaysia so that there'll be a tourism push as well. But I think they're going to try to keep a lot of the usual political drama under wraps if possible.
Thailand?
Oh, it's a tough one. You go first.
I would not be sitting comfortably if I was Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra. Because one, you face these huge structural problems. The economy is experiencing pretty sluggish growth. They're trying to inject capital into it via the e-wallet scheme, but there's only so much you can juice the economy when the underlying structures just aren't there. Relatively high labor and production costs, relatively uneducated or undereducated workforce compared to neighboring competitors, persistent inability to kind of get on to the next big thing, whether that's AI or semiconductor manufacturing or what have you. And then this really unnecessary own goal, I think, where they've rushed so quickly to incentivize Chinese EV manufacturers to set up shop that they've pretty negatively impacted the existing automotive manufacturing sector, which is Japanese dominated and accounts for a huge chunk of local GDP. And now the Chinese EV manufacturers are all saying they can't come in right now anyway. They need more time. So in as much as Puatai's mandate is predicated on turning around the economy, things don't look great. And then on top of that, you have that sort of Damocles, which is if Paetongtarn's numbers begin to drop, and in the lead up to the next election, it looks like they can't be the fire break that the elites need against people's power, then the elites might just decide to throw him overboard, just as they did Pim Seta before her. Plus, her father tends to go out and say things implying that he's really in charge when that's the one thing he's not supposed to be saying.
Yeah, I think a lot of Thailand's challenges are, as you noted, systemic. And because of the political upheaval over the past few decades, it hasn't been able to jumpstart its economy. The question is how Thailand is going to distinguish itself, of course, from all its neighbors in terms of competitiveness. I think demographics is also a huge factor. Doesn't have that demographic youth bulge that other countries like Vietnam, for example, enjoys. So it's banking on digitalization, as many Southeast Asian countries are. But I think there is fundamentally, and I would say this of almost all Southeast Asian countries, a lack of awareness about what it is that countries want to get out of digitalization, apart from this vague notion of boosting economic growth.
Should we close with Indonesia? I guess we have to.
Sure. Let's
Apologies to Laos and Cambodia and Brunei, but we should really
and
talk
Singapore.
about Indonesia. And Singapore.
Indonesia, I think we're in for an exciting period ahead with Prabowo. Although there again, I think a number of his domestic initiatives are going to run up against very real on-the-ground obstacles. This whole idea of providing meals for children, how is that going to be funded adequately? Still question up in the air. He has talked a big game, and now it's up to him and his team to buckle down on the details, which unfortunately are few and far between what we've heard so far.
The free meals program for school children, the free milk program, which is where it started and has grown since then. People talk about this offhandedly like it's small potatoes, and I guess that's the way it sounds, but it's really not. This would be a huge expense, but also potentially one of the most impactful things that an Indonesian president has done since Reformasi. I mean, Indonesia, at its level of economic development per capita, has a shocking level of child stunting and malnutrition. And if you want to unlock that demographic benefit and move up the value chain, you can't leave everybody who lives outside of the Jakarta metro area behind. I think this is more important than people give credit for. The other big thing I'll be watching, of course, is if they actually do move the capital to Nusantara from Jakarta. Call me a continued skeptic.
I mean, I don't think it will be done in a year. Obviously, this is going to be over different stages. But to go back to your point about child stunting and malnutrition, Indonesia in general has a huge problem of food insecurity. And so this is only one angle, a very important one, no less. But there are challenges for Indonesia in terms of its importation of rice as well. And Indonesia, of course, is an extremely large country, nearly 300 million people, and feeding its population in a way that ensures adequate nutrition for every single individual is, as you mentioned, huge uphill challenge.
Okay, well, apologies again to Brunei, Cambodia, and Laos and Singapore, but I think we should cut it off there. This has been our look ahead to the rest of 2025. Elina and I will be back in a couple of weeks with a more normal episode of Southeast Asia Radio. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Southeast Asia Radio. Feel free to write us with any comments, questions, or feedback at scaradio@csas.org. We'll get back to you.
Do us a favor and subscribe and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever streaming platform that you listen to us on. Tell your friends about us.
Marla Hiller is our producer. Our co-hosts today were Greg Poling and Elina Noor. My name is Japhet Kitson.
And I'm Lauren Mai.
And we'll see you in 2 weeks for another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.